Hey everybody, welcome to the crew. I'm Sea Lord Janda, and this is the history of the world. The year is now 2000 BCE. The last 2 centuries saw the fall of the Old Kingdom and rise of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, while in Mesopotamia the Akkadian Empire collapsed, was followed by the Neo-Sumerian Empire, or the Third Dynasty of Ur, and that in turn collapsed and was replaced by, well, more or less nothing at the moment. The aftereffects of the 4.2 kilo-year climate event are probably still having an impact on humanity. Civilization in China and India has and will continue in this century to see drastic changes as well, so it's been a very chaotic few centuries for the world. But you know what? Civilization has survived, and it will thrive again. So, this map, bit of an overview of the spread of civilization across the world. It's not exact, obviously. I didn't make it. I don't make any of the graphics. Full confession, if you couldn't figure that out. But anyway, this map is a little optimistic in my opinion. It accords Punt and Nordichico the status of state societies, which is probably unlikely. Personally, I would say they're complex farming societies more likely. But anyway, the key is actually missing. Blue is intended to indicate states, orange, complex farming societies, green, simple or partial farming societies. Purple is nomadic pastoralists, aka herders. And yellow is fully non-agricultural hunter-gatherers. So the map is probably basically accurate, and it should give you an idea of how far agriculture has spread around the world by this time in particular. As you can see across the whole, not exactly equatorial, but the band from northwestern Europe to southeastern Asia has at least basic agriculture almost everywhere by now. Not all of it's settled. I would say green is more of your part farming, but still hunter-gatherer and just grows some crops and then comes back to them every once in a while. Your orange is a lot more definitively settled, but not full civilization level. Alright, enough about that. Speaking of Nordichico, we are overdue for an update on the Americas. There is some evidence suggesting that there is currently possibly some kind of centrally organized civilization at Nordichico. They've managed to build these 2 pyramids, among other significant structures. The thing holding them back from me thinking of them as a state-level society is mainly there's just no hard evidence to demonstrate definitively an organized government or culture. I mean, they clearly did have have some kind of organized society given the ability to build these pyramids. But whether it was a permanent state level thing, there's not even any sort of real writing system, translatable or not, that we've been able to find. They definitely have a complex farming society. It's probably pretty settled, but state government level, there's just not anything to say what shape that would have taken if it did definitively exist. But they've domesticated the most vital of American crops, the sweet potato. They have squash, they have beans, guava, a few others, maize, of course, the most essential cereal crop of the Americas, and they have cotton, which they use for a lot of textile production. Now, this all sounds very promising. You're probably wondering why I'm so skeptical about the state-level society thing. They are really lacking some things which we've seen very widely across other civilizations, especially pottery and ceramics. And maybe that's just something they missed, but we found none of that. And as a result, if they did have advanced art, writing systems, etc., the things you would expect from a civilization, none of them have survived. It's possible they're using weaved cotton to store information on, which in a way sounds more modern than pottery. But if they are, it will not last. None of it will survive to the present day. to be preserved for future generations, unlike all the pottery in the Middle East. So overall, I would put the Nordichico civilization under the label of intriguing at the moment. It's sort of... There's clearly something there, but it's lacking some of the critical elements of most of the old world civilizations. And to be frank, whatever is there, it will not last long, and it will not spread across the continent in the same way that the old world civilizations are. That being said, Nordichico aside, maize cultivation is definitely spreading widely across the Americas, and the potato has now been domesticated in the Andes, which is probably part of what's providing the agricultural package to get more complex societies kicked off at last. Another breakthrough in the Americas lately: the domestication of the cocoa or cacao bean. It's spread from the Amazon into Mesoamerica, and it has become popular. The beans, it turns out with some work, can be turned into a sweet beverage, and if you throw in the pulp around the beans, it's alcoholic, which certainly gives it a nice boost as far as its spread through humanity goes. And this is a particularly ancient image of a man drinking hot chocolate, basically. It wouldn't taste exactly the same as our modern stuff, but same principle, I believe. Now, skipping over the Pacific, we come to China. The situation there is still not really totally clear. I touched on the historicity of the Xia dynasty in the last episode. The TLDR from there is, we can't confirm with any certainty that the Xia dynasty that is said in legend to rule over China in this period actually exists. There's really no contemporary evidence to verify any of its specific rulers. No attestations of their names from that time or anything like that. No tombs that we can definitively say belongs to them. What we can say is the people living in China have undergone a pretty significant shift lately. Possibly partly the result of drought from the 4.2 kiloyear event, maybe not. Also partly the result of entering the Bronze Age in earnest. The city known as Erlitou has become a major center of the production of bronze, and lends its name to the new Erlitou culture, which is succeeding the previous Longshan culture. And the big difference? Bronze. Tools, weapons, vessels, as in pots and such, instruments, all coming out of Erlitou in numbers. The Bronze Age has arrived in earnest along the Yellow River, and it does seem, from what we know archaeologically, like the Yellow River has overtaken the Yangtze as the most advanced and populated portion of China, though we're not that certain about that. So Erlitou may indeed, frankly, probably is the capital of some sort of organized, centralized state, and there may well be others along the Yellow River as well. But we just don't have any certain information on who would have ruled these, other than the legendary Xia, who may be based on some distantly remembered reality, but may also be entirely fictional propaganda from later dynasties. China is definitely reaching a pretty advanced state, but is also still sort of fundamentally in prehistory due to the lack of writing. Now, in the Indus River Valley, things are not going so well. Most of civilization is kind of picking up the pieces from the 4.2 kiloyear event or whatever other causes of troubles they've had lately. I'm afraid it's just not happening here. The civilization around the Indus has existed in a mature form for 700 years now, and in an incipient form for over 1,000. But it is crumbling. We can say with certainty there's been a sharp increase, that is, in violence and disease. The great cities along the river, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and others, are rapidly becoming depopulated. And in another century or two, this civilization is going to simply cease to exist. Why? Because this is an exceptionally rare case, really, for a civilization this well established. It's probably a unique case for a civilization this well established, with writing and everything, even if we can't translate it, to simply collapse back into almost nothing, not overtaken by invaders or anything, but to collapse down to virtually nothing. Probably unique. Why? Well, the leading candidate ultimately is climate change. It's still controversial, but the 4.2 kiloyear event has probably greatly disrupted the regular monsoon in the Indus Valley. The floods of the Indus, on which the civilization depended for agriculture, have become erratic and weak. The Gagar Hakra, which you can also see on this map, one of the major, would have then been the tributaries, I believe, has basically ceased to exist and has become just a seasonal river. And the resulting crop failures and famines have led to fierce competition for food, general chaos. The civilization is simply collapsing thanks to widespread famine and changes in our agricultural conditions. They never really had major irrigation systems built up here. They had a lot of control over water with reservoirs and even primitive sewage systems, but they never really developed a large irrigation system, and they probably did not have the capacity to survive any long-term failure of the river floods. Most of the surviving people have fled eastwards towards the Ganges, where the remaining population has established many villages and some towns, but no great cities as of yet, and it will be many generations before they could recover to boast the kind of population that the Indus River Valley civilization had. This is a sobering note for the other three major Old World civilizations, because the Indus Valley civilization really was quite well established, and it's crumbling due to factors that are totally outside of the control of humanity at this point. And when one looks at, say, the salinification problem in Sumeria, well, there's still cause to be worried about the fate of civilization in the end. It's perhaps more robust than you might have predicted, but it's still terribly fragile, subject to the whims of the planet in a sense, which at this time we have no way of influencing. Well, following on from that sober note, a cool, hip new note. So they domesticated the horse out on the Eurasian steppes quite a while ago, but they've now learned how to hook those horses up to a two-wheeled vehicle for the purpose of making war. Why not simply ride the horses, you ask? Well, they're not big enough. They don't have strong enough backs. They can't handle the weight of a heavily armed and armored fighter at this point. And we also don't have saddles or stirrups, which mean it's pretty hard to stay on a horse in a melee, even if it could bear your weight. On the previous note, we are very early in the selective breeding process for horses still. Their original horses were not as large as many of those we have now, and some of them probably just aren't fit to ride at all at this point. But even when they are, adding 100 pounds of gear, riding them into a war, and hoping they don't panic, it wouldn't have worked yet. Also, the bows at this time are not very practical for horseback use. Nobody has anything like a recurve bow yet. And so a two-man chariot team can have a driver and a dedicated archer or javelin thrower. Also, this bowl you're seeing, this is in the Louvre. Your stick figure art can make it big one day, as long as you create it 4,000 years ago. So as you may recall from previous episodes, we've been looking for tin for the last 1,000 years or so. There's some tin in the Middle East, or the Near East, whatever you want to call it. A little bit in the Levant, in Cyprus, Turkey. There's more way over by India, but that's hard to get to and is sort of not really even in the core areas of the Indus Valley civilization. We've managed to import some from Central Europe, but there's never been a great source of tin for Egypt and Mesopotamia, really. And we need tin to alloy with copper to make bronze, which is, of course, the first and foremost metal at this point. Copper still around, but it's just not as good as bronze. But now we have finally hit the mother lode. It turns out all the tin is in Cornwall, also Brittany and Iberia, But for whatever reason, the largest source on the European continent is Cornwall, and tin is now being mined and traded overland across what's now France and Germany, all the way to the Mediterranean, where it's shipped to Egypt and eventually to Mesopotamia. And I really can't overstate how important this is. The tin source is basically distant and mysterious to the people actually receiving it in Egypt and Mesopotamia, but it's unbelievably important for the production of bronze. And this will allow bronze production to take off to a much greater extent than ever before. If you remember from previous episodes, the only alternative is arsenic bronze, which has some unfortunate side effects, such as arsenic, which is not good for blacksmiths. So now let's talk about our two most well-established civilizations, Mesopotamia and Egypt. The situation in Mesopotamia is a bit of a mess in 2000 BCE. The third dynasty of Ur has just collapsed a few years ago. There is no single successor state, and spoiler, there won't be one during the rest of this century. Elamite control of Ur after capturing it to bring the dynasty to an end does not last. They are soon driven back out of Mesopotamia by various Sumerian and Amorite powers. You'll recall the Amorites were the major northern invaders of Ur before the Elamites dealt the final blow. Most notably, the dynasty of Isin gets involved, which you'll see is one of the cities along the Euphrates there. I'll go over that in a second. So the Amorites, heavily responsible for the destruction of the third dynasty of Ur, they aren't really able to secure total dominance over the region either, though. They do attain the kingship of quite a few cities, notably a small town of little current significance called Babylon, which will come back to be important in future episodes. The most immediately powerful ruler, though, turns out to be Ishbi-Erra of Isin. Ishbi-Erra was previously an official for the last king of Ur, Ibisin, and he wrested control of the city of Isin for himself during the collapse of the Ur dynasty, and in the chaos early this century, he manages to deal significant defeats to both the Amorite and Elamite armies, and it's his forces that actually retake Ur from the Elamites. Since he was part of the former administration of Ur, he more or less sort of portrays himself as a continuation of that dynasty, or the successor to that dynasty, but it would not really be accurate. He is able to take Ur, Uruk, and Nippur, which are some of the most critical cities of Samaria, of course, but he doesn't control anything outside of the heartland. Nippur is pretty much the northern limit, and various regional centers, such as Assur in the far north along the Tigris, which is now or soon will be under Amorite rule, and Elam remain very competitive in strength, along with he can't really assert his authority over all the cities in Sumer very effectively either. But it's the closest thing we've got to a centralized government for a while here, and he's able to engage in various building projects, forms a new centralized government of sorts, which we call the Dynasty of Isin. Now, Ishbi-Erra dies in about 1986, is succeeded by his son Shu-Ilishu. He rules 9 or 10 years. It's a pretty peaceful time. He rebuilds the walls of Isin, does quite a bit to reconstruct Ur, recovers the idol of their patron god Nana, which was looted by the Elamites, and he's succeeded on his death in about 1976 by Idin Dagan. That's Iddin Dagan. Idin Dagan. Little is known about him, except he continues participating in the fertility ritual with the priestess of Inanna, which is supposed to make the land and people fertile, and involves him having sex with the priestess of Inanna, so good for him. He reigns about 20 years and is succeeded by Ishme Dagan, of whom there's enough evidence to prove he exists, but precious little else. He rules about 18 years, apparently, but we don't know much about most of these kings from the dynasty of Isin. There's not that many depictions of them, not that much information. They're pretty powerful at this moment in time, but not as powerful as their predecessors, nor do they last as long. They just don't have the power and prominence to make the kind of impact that gives us a good idea of them in the modern era. There are still numerous competing states and dynasties across Mesopotamia that are just the strongest. Ishme-Dagan is succeeded probably about 1938 by Lipit Ishtar, who apparently wins a victory over the Amorites, who are still an ongoing threat, it seems, although they're beginning to sort of assimilate into the area, which is sort of inevitably what tends to happen to migratory tribes that conquer a civilized area. They just inherently almost never have the population to really culturally dominate a civilized area, even if they have the military power. But anyway, Lipit Ishtar apparently wins a victory over the Amorites. He writes a new legal code. He reigns for 10 years. It's not a great reign because it does see a major disruption in the realm. An Amorite by the name of Gunganum succeeds his brother as king of Larsa, then a pretty minor city. He changes that status rather quickly. He conducts 2 campaigns eastward against Elam, sacking the major city of Ansan and bringing him great wealth and prestige, and he very quickly uses that wealth and prestige. In about 1923, he takes from Isin after presumably a major military victory, which hugely undermines Isin's claim to be the successors of the 3rd dynasty of and leaves the region split between Larsa and Isin. This may have been the trigger for the fall of Lipit Ishtar. He is shortly thereafter overthrown by a certain Ninurta. Now, Ninurta struggles with legitimacy as a usurper. Tends to happen. He emphasizes his pastoral, fatherly role over his people, the shepherd. But he can't stop Gunganum from advancing, and by 1914, Gunganum takes both Uruk and the holy city of Nippur, which makes him Larsa, more or less the dominant power in Samaria for the time being, and really undermines Isin. Gunganum sets about consolidating his power. He can't actually take Isin, so he builds a great new wall around Larsa. He improves the defenses of other construction works, and he dies in about 1906 after a reign of 26 years, in which he's brought Larsa from a minor power into the status of strongest city in Samaria. But Ninurta is still holding on to the throne in Isin by then, and is a little more firmly enthroned at that point. And against Gunganum's heir Abasare, Ninurta is able to retake Nippur and then drive south along the 2 rivers. And as we reach 1900 BCE, the 2 powers are at war, and a potentially decisive confrontation between Ninurta and Abasare is imminent, most likely, subject to some considerable uncertainty about the exact dating of any events whatsoever at this time. Could have happened already, honestly, but hard to say. By contrast, Egypt is sitting pretty as probably the most stable state in the world in 2000 BCE. Certainly the strongest, most likely. I realize I just threw a qualifier on certainly, but we really don't know that much for certain about these times still. Anyway, thanks to the recent rise of the Middle Kingdom, they have more or less restored order and unity in the region. Mentuhotep III here has sat the throne for most of a decade. He took it as an older man after the long reign of his father. He's conducted building projects. He's traded with Punt in the south. He dies shortly after the turn of the century in 1997, and is succeeded by his presumed son via Emi, Mentuhotep IV. Mentuhotep IV here, on the right, reigns only 6 or 7 years. It's probably not a stable time. The usual mining in the Sinai takes place, but there's not a lot of documentation for his reign, and he's omitted from the later Abydos king list. He may have had to organize some sort of major military expedition. Not certain why. When he dies, after a relatively short reign, he's succeeded by his vizier, Amenemhat I. If you're wondering about this image, Mentuhotep IV is on the right. The left is the fertility god Min, who is almost always depicted erect. Welcome to ancient religion. So anyway, Amenemhat the First, that's Amenemhat, is almost certainly not related to Mentuhotep, and may have overthrown him violently, although it's also possible Mentuhotep IV died prematurely without issue, and Amenemhat was simply the best positioned to take advantage of that power vacuum. The good news for Egypt is that regardless of how exactly he comes to power, Amenemhat does not introduce a new period of prolonged chaos. He founds the 12th dynasty of Egypt. His accession is not unchallenged. He has to conduct several military campaigns early in his reign, with the help of his general Khnumhotep, who becomes a governor afterwards. He has to defeat a Sigersini of Nubia, Asiatics, quote, which means probably some foe from the Levant. The Egyptians tend to refer to everything east of the Sinai as Asia, which is technically correct, but sort of broad. And he had possibly local opposition as well. But evidently, Amenemhat triumphs over all of them, because he stays in firm control over Egypt for quite a long time thereafter. He is obviously concerned about his legitimacy. He reverts to the old kingdom practice of building pyramids, which the 11th dynasty had dropped. He builds what would have once been quite a large 55-meter pyramid at El Lisht, in which he's buried, although it was built somewhat shoddily, using cheap materials compared to the old kingdom ones, and has since collapsed. That said, his reign is a long one, at least 30 years, in the course of which he has definitely at least one son, Senusret I, via his wife, Nefertityanin, and at least 3 other children. But despite his long and mostly secure reign, Amenemhat is apparently assassinated by his own guards in about 1971 BCE. Senusret I, who is the presumed heir, is apparently on campaign in Libya when his father dies, but he's able to rush back and claim the throne without being seriously challenged, so far as we know. Maybe because his father crowned him co-regent 10 years prior. That's not 100% clear, but it seems like it might have been done, and begins a new tradition for the 12th dynasty in the process, which Senusret will carry on. Now, this may be the first, but is definitely not the last case of a ruler crowning their heir as co-ruler during their lifetime. It is intended to help assure the succession. Senusret marries his sister, Neferu III, and has at least 6 children during what will be a long and prosperous reign over Egypt. He campaigns at least twice into Nubia, firmly establishing Egypt's border at the second cataract of the Nile, where he builds a garrison. He does plenty of building, including restoring the Temple of Ra in Heliopolis, and building a pair of obelisks there to celebrate his 30th year on the throne, one of which still stands. He builds various other temples, quarries the Sinai and Wadi Hammamat, and is finally buried in a pyramid at El Lisht, near his father, when he dies in 1926 BCE after a reign of 45 years. Now, Senusret, succeeded by his son and co-regent, designated heir, Amenemhat II. Now, he has a long reign like his predecessors, though he's a bit poorly attested nonetheless. We don't know who his queen or queens are, possibly a senate, and he might have at least 7 children, but we don't know any of them definitively. He apparently conducts the usual temple building projects. He mines the Sinai Peninsula. He launches a military expedition into Asia, which is probably just immediately across the Sinai Peninsula into Canaan, although to what end is unclear. In any case, his reign seems to be stable, and he's still sitting the throne as of 1900 BCE, having been pharaoh for a quarter century and with some life left in him yet. Now, a few honorable mentions. This fellow, William the Faience Hippopotamus. He is one of the finest examples of Egyptian craftsmanship from this period. He is not actually glass as such, rather he's a form of glazed or vitrified quartz called faience. Now, he might have been shaped by hand, or he might actually have been cast in a mold, and there are similar works depicting various subjects in existence. He's found in the tomb of an official of Senusret I, and interestingly, he had 3 of his legs broken intentionally so that he couldn't kill that official in the afterlife, because hippopotami are very dangerous. But this is an example of the sort of sculptural art that was in existence, even on sort of a smaller scale. I mean, the pharaohs obviously were capable of grand monumental projects and elaborate relief carvings and statues of themselves and all that, but in general, art was fairly advanced already, and this faience glass thing is relatively new at this time. So, we reach 1900 BCE. The world is still in a bit of a state of chaos. Things are coming along nicely in Egypt. Yes, the Middle Kingdom is firmly established. It's under a series of long-lived rulers and doing quite well for itself. In China, things do seem to be becoming more organized and centralized. We don't know the exact details with any certainty, but it's headed in the right direction. The Indus River Valley civilization, however, is in the process of collapsing entirely, sadly, and Mesopotamia remains divided between various mostly hostile powers, with Eson and Larsa only the largest of the more civilized states there. So, who will come out on top in that war for Sumeria? Subscribe, and tune in next time to find out. Thanks for watching.